In addition to her time at Wellesley, she holds a non-resident senior fellow position at the Brookings Institution, a prominent think tank in Washington, D.C., in the Center for East Asian Policy. She has authored numerous writings on North Korean politics. She has received many academic research grants from the U.S. Fulbright Program and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at Princeton University, just to name a few. She received her BA magna cum laude from Smith College and her PhD in politics from Princeton. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, she is an avid gardener and truly enjoys Game of Thrones and the Netflix original series, The Crown. Please help me in welcoming Professor Catherine Moon to the Albright Institute.
Some of the things you mentioned made me go down memory lane. The past, quote, achievements like college, but for you, it's so real. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. The Albright Institute is such an important part of Wellesley now. It's an institution unto itself. And I know that many of my students in political science, international relations, and related fields apply and are accepted and then walk out having such fantastic experiences. So congratulations to all of you, because I know it is difficult to be sitting here right now, meaning to have been accepted to be able to sit here. And I admire you in January when I'd rather be sleeping or having hot tea at will, that you are up early, dressed, and alert. So I thank you for your energy. I want to talk about North Korea, and today what I want to do is try to talk to you and with you about North Korea in ways that you may not normally have access to. So I want to talk about what are the myths regarding North Korea. And myths, as many of you know, if you study mythology, it's not that all myths are fake, but myths can be self-generated by the author of the myth for a creative purpose, and one can call political power, political consolidation, and political legitimacy a creative purpose if you are a dictator and an authoritarian regime that wants to have power. We also have myths out of ignorance. If we don't know, we basically turn stereotypes and the everyday common utterances that don't make us really think and analyze, we accept as truth and take them for granted, and that also becomes a myth. And the reason why I think myths are dangerous in our world today regarding North Korea, especially as people living in the United States, is that unless we understand North Korea not only as this scary nuclear power, but as a place with its own history, with its own cultural traditions that transform over time, as a place with beautiful places, a landscape, geography, as a place with music and the arts, even if it is controlled by a totalitarian regime, people still find ways to find their own agency, their own innovation, and their creativity. So unless we get to know North Korea also from what I call the inside out, understanding what motivates the people, the regime, the leadership. And when we talk about the regime, it is not just this monolithic group of people or one man called Kim Jong-un or his predecessors who run the country. No one dictator ever was able to run any country. They need people around them. They need people supporting them. They need people who fund them. And so they are beholden to others in ways that we don't normally think about. And I think especially with the nuclear issue, which we'll talk about more in depth at lunchtime and in the afternoon panel, it is really difficult for Americans especially to understand how to look at, let alone resolve, the issues regarding North Korea, because we tend to have a very surface understanding of North Korea, based on the myths, sometimes based on lies, the lies that sometimes the North Korean regime creates, as well as the lies that are created about the North Korean regime. For example, Just yesterday, the entire world, and definitely Hawaii and the United States, felt great alarm that nuclear missiles were coming toward Hawaii, most likely from North Korea, and Hawaiian citizens were put on alert. That turned out to be a mistake. This morning, I always check the online news before I look at the paper New York Times. Yes, I read the paper New York Times. I look at the online news just to make sure that something hasn't happened in the Koreas, or to the Koreas. So I checked and I said, okay, no missile tests. Both Koreas are still there. They're still at it with the discussions over the Olympics, etc. And yet, what was the top listed news item online? The fact that the Japanese National Broadcasting Service, the NHK, which is run by the government, had put out an error emergency message to the entire country that North Korea has launched missiles and that people should take shelter. And then NHK had to retract and apologize, right? These things are scary because accidents, we being human beings, obviously are already happening. And this is why we worry about nuclear weapons, not just because evil regime leaders might push buttons and compete over whose button is bigger, as Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim have been doing this past week or so, but because errors can be made and you could have unintended military exchanges of the nuclear kind, which is just unthinkable, except that it is thinkable because it's literally happening before our eyes. And so unless and until we understand why these situations occur, what on earth made, we know in Hawaii that it was a human error based on poor training. They were being trained how to send out messages. They just weren't trained how to cancel the messages, okay? So literally the wrong computer button was pushed. That was just a basic human error that created a lot of stress for people. Why then did it take 38 minutes to dispel the notion and correct that information? That's what a lot of Hawaiians are angry about. But when we look at the Japanese error, I have to ask, where on earth and why on earth would they have gotten this inkling of an information, quote unquote, that the North Koreans had launched? And I have to wonder, are there some biases built into the media intelligence community? Are they looking for things that may misleadingly lead people to assume that bad things are happening out of North Korea? A lot of bad things happen out of North Korea, but doesn't mean that they launched a nuclear missile. So, always go beyond the surface and beyond the news that's being asked and ask the why. And one other thing that I will share with you today is it is so difficult to know anything about North Korea with certitude. And so as researchers, the question is, how do we make sure that we are getting good, solid information? And also, when we cannot, how do we use our own eyes, ears, nose, if you're there and you smell, whatever it is, use all our senses and our creative analytical energies to try to infer in a learned way about what may or may not be going on in North Korea. I was there in late July, early August of 2013 on a so-called field study research trip, but I went as a common tourist because nobody can go there and really do research. But I was with a team of researchers, all historians from Canada, and I was the only US-based American citizen who went, and I became an honorary Canadian. And I felt very safe, much safer than going as an explicit American because, Canadians are welcomed everywhere in the world. They're the nice North Americans. Nobody's threatened by Canadians, and even the North Koreans. They asked me, "Are you with the Canada bus?" I said, "Yes, yes, yes." They said, "Go, go, 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 go." But what we did was, about 7 of us, all of them were historians who knew so much about North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, Russia. We were just absorbing information like sponges. And we couldn't take notes because they may get confiscated. We don't know. But that was also our myth. We assume they'll get confiscated. So we're cramming everything into our heads and trying to remember and trying to analyze. And it was the most intense learning experience, and also nearly caused a brain explosion for all of us. And it took us all about 6 months to unpack what our experience had been. But that was because we were doing such intensive, quote, research. With everything we saw, everything we touched, everything we didn't see, didn't hear as well. So I'll talk about that. Okay, so North Korea, myths, lies, truths. This is a common photograph of North Korea that we see. And this is a ICBM that North Korea parades. And people look at North Korea, and this is another myth, as a secretive society, right? The funny thing about North Korea is that in some ways, it's a great source of information for the things that we want to know, because they show them off. They show them off to their public. They show them off in their national newspapers, which then get disseminated abroad, and we get satellite images. I mean, we know at what stage they're building certain types of rockets, missiles, what kind of advancements they've made. And this is just another regular military parade, okay, with tons of military vehicles and armaments being shown off to the society and to the world. So we have our whiteboard leader here. I want to take from you the common perceptions, the common, perhaps misperceptions, the common characterizations, myths, let's call them. Maybe they turn out to be truths that you have about North Korea to start off with. So just unleash and vent. Just throw them out and she'll put them up on the whiteboard.
Rocket Man.
Rocket Man, yes. Mr. Trump called Mr. Kim Little Rocket Man. Aha. Go ahead.
So I think of there being like almost like a dark cloud over North Korea, like we can't see anything and we can't know anything about it.
Okay, so unknowable, opaque, right? Anyone else? Just 1, 2 words.
Human rights violations.
Okay, human rights violator.
Dangerous.
Dangerous. Very dangerous. What else?
Restricted.
Restricted. Good.
Isolation.
Isolated. Good. What else?
Assassinations.
Ah, assassinations. Yes. Of even relatives, right? Go ahead.
Anti-Western.
Anti-Western. What else? Poverty. Yep.
Starvation.
Starvation. Good. What else?
Nukes.
Nukes. Yes. Nuclear power. What else? Cruel. Okay, excellent. Anyone else? Indoctrination of the people, right? What else? Yes. Unpredictable. Anything else?
Cult of personality.
Okay, cult of personality cult.
Detained tourists.
Okay, abuse of tourists, let's say. Okay. One last person. Yeah.
Torn apart family relationships.
Okay, excellent. Divided families across the peninsula in the south and north. That is a fact. That is a truth. That is historically, we can provide you with evidence, okay? There's no myth around that. All right, look at all of these, right? Now, how many of these are facts? How many of these are myths? How many of these are lies? How many of them also are somewhere in between these areas? Half-truths, half-myths, half-facts, partial facts, right? I mean, Kim Jong-un is Rocket Man, but not in the way that Trump had called him. North Korea is hard to know, but is it unknowable, right? Abuse of Tourists, yes, we hear about the tourists who get detained, and in the case of Otto Warmbier, who was a UVA student, he came back in a coma and then died, and we still don't know what happened. He also went to North Korea on a tour with a tour company that is known to be an unreliable tour company that basically focuses on millennials who go to North Korea and get drunk. So there were newspaper reports that he was out till 5 in the morning or something drinking vodka in a North Korean hotel, and they were supposed to be getting ready to take off on their flight back to Beijing and back to the United States or the UK or wherever, just a few hours after that, okay? Those are the things we don't hear about much. Of all the thousands of tourists who have gone to North Korea, almost every one of them returned safely. I'm one of them, right? There are thousands, especially from Asia and from Europe, who go every year, and a significant number from the United States, Canada, Australia, and 99.9% of them return fine. So why do we hear about the handful, right, who get detained? And also, if you read about some of those tourists who went, they're doing things they should not be doing, right? In any society, if you go, it's your responsibility to learn how to behave. When you go on study abroad and you ask your professors to write letters for you on your behalf, we usually say, this student is very mature and will be able to handle cultural differences and will be able to adapt, etc., to assure the other side that you'll manage, right? So many things we don't know about, even when we do learn about it. Guess where this is? This is also North Korea. North Korea has some of the most beautiful mountainous scenery. It is relatively unpolluted compared to, let's say, its East Asian neighbors, and many small hamlets, and they look very much like South Korea, actually, if you know about what a South Korean countryside looks like. I took this from the inside of the bus, and I took tons and tons of these kinds of pictures because I, as a scholar, wanted to remind myself, as much as I study and analyze all the crazy stuff that happens out of North Korea, the difficult things, that this is a place where trees grow, where the mountains still undulate, and where people live out their lives. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. 3 figures who are critical to North Korea. Kim Il-sung, one of the founders of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Not the founder, as the cult of personality states, right? The son, Kim Jong-il, Mr. Perm, the permed head, and his son, the current leader, Kim Jong-un, who is only about 10 years older than you all. Imagine running a country and having been thrown into this position, not having been prepared, as is the case. These are the folks that you see when people say North Korea. These are the people in North Korea, except me. Well, I was in North Korea. This is Pyongyang. This was one of our tour guides. I'll call her Miss Kim. And she studied history at their Harvard University, Kim Il-sung University. She is the daughter of a brigadier general, so she is an elite. And she was about 25 at the time, and over an 11-day period, she followed all the Korean traditions that South Koreans follow and that many Korean Americans follow, calling me 언니, big sister. For those of you who speak Chinese, 제제. 언니 all the time. And we had incredible talks. At first, she did the whole proper formal thing. And over time, every day, more and more personal talks. And I asked her, aren't you getting any pressure to get married? She said, yes. And I said, do you have a boyfriend? And she said, yes, but my parents, I don't know if they'll really accept, just like any other culture. And then she says, and I don't really want to get married early because, you see, in North Korea, we have to go live with the in-laws. Oh my God, have I heard this story in South Korea? Right? And I don't want to live with my in-laws. Oh, good for you. You want to have independence, right? You don't want to be a servant to your husband's side. This is the same story Korean women on both sides of the divided 38th parallel have been experiencing for hundreds of years, right? Then she tells me about they would also have to wait a year or two to find an apartment of their own, very similar to Chinese situations, okay? So, and then one of the most poignant moments toward the end of my stay, I was so tired and my feet hurt, and I found that to be very beneficial because I took a rest, and she had to stay with me because tourists, foreigners have to have somebody with them all the time. So we sat in front of the Chuche Tower, this iconic tower, while my friends went up and climbed. And we sat down and we chatted. And it was a busy street for Pyongyang. And she said to me, "언니, in Seoul, are the cities so filled with cars like this?" This was a two-lane street, but it had a lot of cars. And I really thought hard, how do I answer her question? Because of course it's, God damn it, yes, of course. I mean, Seoul cities, you get killed, you know, because there are multiple lanes and there are so many cars and too many cars and they're all over the place. And I don't want to insult her. So I said, after some thought, I said, if you and I were sitting in Seoul now, which is even a little dangerous to say, I said, if you and I were sitting right here on a Seoul street, you would not be able to see the other side of the road. She got my answer, right? Without my having to humiliate her and say, are you kidding me? This is nothing, right? So there were these very poignant moments, and she was very quiet and reflective. Okay? Her English was perfect, nearly perfect. She had never, ever traveled to the outside of the country except to Dandong, China once. She had never had English training by native English speakers, but nearly perfect English. It was quite impressive. This is a photograph of school kids. Yes. These people, these are fake smiles, okay? These are all photoshopped, all right? These are real smiles. North Koreans laugh, they sing, they go to school, they complain about their teachers, you know, like every other school kid. And if you notice, these uniforms, these are relatively new uniforms that came into popularity after Kim Jong-un, the young leader, assumed office. One of the things he did was to spiffy up young people's exteriors. New uniforms, sharp, and many of them, most of them have these red kerchiefs, the white, and the middle school kids and the high school kids, they're wearing what would be considered miniskirts for North Koreans. I mean, they're pretty short. I was shocked, okay, because it's a very prudish, socially very prudish country, historically. And one of the reasons I heard that Kim Jong-un had done this is because he himself is youthful, and also he wanted to create a new image of North Korea, and it's also a way to gain the support of young people. And he's quite popular with young people, okay? And the assassinations, most of the assassinations, he was changing the old guard. The folks who were serving his father, in some cases maybe even his grandfather, but he has been changing the guard, and he's been trying to rejuvenate, literally, the North Korean elite class, the governing class. And this is happening in the Korea Workers' Party, it's happening in his government. So, it's always important to know where North Korea is. Yesterday at dinner with some of the speakers for today, we were talking about a recent Pew Foundation survey where most Americans could not place North Korea on a map. They pointed to Japan, they pointed to Russia. Professor Metaxas, what was some of the more outrageous countries they pointed to?
When you look at all of the map that you have in front of you,
Yeah.
there will be a point there.
Yeah, this is North Korea, that's North Korea, this is North Korea, right? So Americans, we know we're bad at geography, but if you don't know why the Koreas are so important, you have to, in order to know why the Koreas are important, you have to know the geography. This is the northern part, this is the southern part. It used to be one unified country since late 8th century, okay? And we can debate the dates, but basically both Koreas talk about a history that goes back thousands of years, all right? And this is China. Look at the size of China. Look at the size of the Koreas. This is Japan. We're so close. This is Russia, right? So North Korea borders China here and North Korea. Vladivostok, one of the major port cities in Russia, okay? There are North Koreans in Vladivostok, Russians in North Korea. There are North Koreans over the border in China, and Chinese, of course, who also come over the border to North Korea. South Korea, very close to Japan. And so when North Korea lobs missiles, and you often hear about it going into the Sea of Japan, it's right here. Or over Hokkaido, like the one in August, over here. Okay? But if you look at this size, and if you look at the little bitty size of the Koreas, the Koreans on both sides of the DMZ have this proverb or saying, such as that even when the whales play, the shrimp get tumbled, assaulted, and killed. Korea is the shrimp. Koreans refer to themselves as a shrimp geopolitically because they are surrounded by great powers. And of course, you have, it's not on the map, but you have the United States, which is a major player in this region. And the notion that whales, these mammoth-sized creatures, would be playing, they're frolicking in the water, and yet the shrimp are just swallowing water and just trying to stay alive, and they're croaking, they're dying, right? That says a lot about Koreans' mentality, of how vulnerable they feel. Now, because South Korea is so wealthy and advanced technologically, et cetera, and K-pop is dominating the world, now a lot of people say, well, South Korea at least has become a dolphin among the whales. You know, it's grown from a shrimp. It doesn't get it's not as vulnerable, but it's that mentality because of this geopolitical landscape, okay? And even if the two Koreas want to improve relations as they're trying now, we'll see how far they get, they cannot come up with plans on their own, policies, because of these great powers, China, Russia, Japan, the United States, okay? This is a map of both Koreas. I wanted you to see some of these. The capital of North Korea is Pyongyang, Seoul. They're very close to one another. This is the DMZ, the 38th parallel. That's the map, the latitude. And that's where the line was drawn by two American soldiers, lower-ranking soldiers, at the end of World War II, when the Americans and the Russians were going to undertake demilitarization of Japanese colonial power on the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese had colonized the peninsula for about 35, 36 years, and the Soviets and the Americans worked together and agreed in World War II that the Soviets would go and demilitarize, okay, and send the Japanese soldiers back home and demilitarize the north, and Americans would demilitarize the south. And two American soldiers drew a map at the 38th parallel saying, let's just divide it there, and the Russians, you guys do that, we'll do it down here. That division that occurred in about 25 minutes' time as a decision, randomly chosen, has stuck since. It was not supposed to be that way. They were supposed to have an election in the late 40s to determine their future for themselves, both Koreas, and to be unified. But that divided line has stuck since 1945, and then became enshrined during the Korean War, 1950 to 53, and afterwards. And so South Koreans, even though South Koreans are allies of the United States, many South Koreans feel serious resentment toward the United States for having had so little regard for their country, for their peninsula, and having been so ignorant of the reality, the existence of this peninsula, that the decision to divide the country was made really in the snap of a finger, without much thought, and basically no one took responsibility for it. The people who made the decision did not take responsibility for it. This is a map of North Korea to show you the different provinces, especially the ones near China, economically do better because they do cross-border trading. The Nason region in the north, Vladivostok is like right around here. So they have access here. There's a special economic zone set up in Nason that the Russians are interested, the Chinese are interested, and some Europeans, but not much going on right now. Pyongyang is here, and this area closest to Pyongyang is considered the most repressed because the government has a closer watch over this region. So whether it's economic entrepreneurism, which is taking place in North Korea now through open markets that people set up, it's more restricted in these areas than in these areas or these areas. Okay. Okay, so the myths. Poor and weak, irrational, crazy, unpredictable. Hermit Kingdom, meaning isolated. Failed state. I'll leave that aside for today, or for this session. Brainwashed, unthinking, loyal robots. I covered many of the thoughts that you had shared, and I'm going to go and talk about them a little bit more methodically, and then we will have Q&A. So, it is a fact, North Korea is very poor. How poor is the question. Singapore is the richest country in East Asia. Okay, this is GDP per capita, 2016, US dollars. You can see for yourself, right? Vietnam. North Korea is at about $1,200 or $1,300 per capita annually. Pakistan is around $1,300, $1,400. Okay, Pakistan is not a closed society. Pakistan is a quasi-ally of the United States. Ghana is around also $1,200, $1,300, something like that. India is at around $1,700, the biggest democracy in the world. So, do all democracies get rich? No, right? Do all totalitarian, authoritarian states stay poor? Absolutely not, right? And is North Korea one of the poorest? No. The World Bank's low income average is $610 per capita GDP per year. And there are countries in the world that have around $300. Okay? So if you compare that, North Korea is poor, but it's not, relative to what? Right? Is always the question. And looking at GDP figures doesn't really tell us much about the quality of life. And what's interesting about North Korea that many people don't know is that North Korea had a stronger economy and higher standards of living than South Korea until the early 1970s. South Korea trailed North Korea economically and in terms of standards of living until the early 1970s. Okay? Both had been destroyed in the war, in the Korean War, but the North had been utterly devastated by US air bombing. Okay? So they rebuilt their societies, and that's why we call South Korea the miracle on the Han River, a miracle or a tiger economy or a dragon economy. If North Korea had not been authoritarian, or if it had been authoritarian and capitalist, like the South Korean state was for around 30 years, North Korea also might have developed into a much more vibrant economy because it was actually doing better than the South. Life expectancy I find really interesting. So in 1960, right, DPRK and ROK are very similar, right? This is life expectancy at the time of birth. In 60, you could live till about 51, 53 on average. and over time switched to 71, 82. There's a bigger gap. I chose 1990 because this is pre-North Korea's Great Famine, which started in 1993 and hit the peak in around 1997, 98. And so I wanted to give you a sense before that ugly blip, right? So that it's an easier or it's a more accurate comparison. ROK, 1990, very close, similar, right? This discrepancy is due significantly to the Great Famine, right? Look at Japan. Japan was already so much more advanced than the two Koreas by 1960. Look at PRC, China. 44, you would die at age 44 on average. Then North Korea did much better in 1990 than China. You live longer, 10 years longer in North Korea. And now in 2015 with China, after this booming economy, this miracle, not much discrepancy in the life expectancy, North Korea versus China, and North Korea even after the Great Famine. Look at Vietnam, which has a slightly higher, about double North Korea's GDP per capita, and its life expectancy is pretty similar, okay, 69, 70. Pakistan, okay, similar GDP per capita, a little bit higher than the North, and the life expectancy is much, much lower, okay? Child mortality rates under the age of 5. How long do they live per 1,000 live births? Here, I could not find North Korea's data in 1960. The earliest I found was 1985. So I changed the comparisons to all 1985. What's interesting is that ROK, South Korea, had about 115 deaths per 1,000. That is very high, under the age of 5. So the kids didn't make it, right? That many kids. North Korea probably had similar, but probably had a slightly lower because North Korea's economy was doing better in 1960 than South Korea's. But by 1985, 35, 15, okay? South Korea's economy really took off in the 70s and 80s. And so you begin to see this discrepancy. But this is a huge drop in 1985 from probably around 110, 111, 112. And then North Korea goes back down to 21 after this large increase in the deaths of children under 5 per 1,000, very high at the height, 1996, 97 of the Great Famine, okay? And then you can look at the comparisons, right? China, still 10.7 deaths, right? And they all go down by 1985, but North Korea had only 35 deaths in 85 per 1,000. China had 54. Pakistan had 152. Pakistan still in 2015, 81 deaths per 1,000 live births, living to age 5. You can see these more carefully later, but these are ways to more carefully assess the quality of life. Not just it's poor, but the question is, but how do people live? Literacy rates. North Korea is at 100%. Now, I don't know why North Korea is 100% and South Korea and Japan are at 99%. I was trying to figure this out, but so many of the statistics I looked at give North Korea 100%. And what's interesting that is female and male, 100%. Okay? You look at Singapore, which has the highest per capita GDP, and you've got 97% and 1980 lower. China, 65% in 1980 and now at 96%, right? So it gives you some comparisons. That's why comparative politics is very important. Now, myth, poor and powerless. Fact is that North Korea, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic Korea, by the 1960s was the second most industrialized country in East Asia after Japan. And North Korea received the legacy of Japanese colonial rule in North Korea is that the Japanese had industrialized the North and not the South. The South served as its rice basket. Okay, so agriculture that was then exported to Japan to feed Japanese and the Japanese military all over the Japanese Empire in the 1930s, 40s. They used northern part of Korea. It was not divided, okay, during the colonial period. They used the northern part as the industrialization base because the North is blessed with rich minerals and other natural resources: coal, gold, iron ore, tungsten, and numerous other natural resources. So the northern part was heavily industrialized and became the Japanese colonial industrial infrastructure for military equipment, for petrochemicals, for machine tools, for weapons parts, aircraft parts, tank parts that were sent out to the Japanese Empire. And the North Koreans had become highly industrialized as a labor force. They were proletarianized way before the South. So they had a consciousness about being a worker, an industrial worker, which is very different a mindset from being an agricultural worker, okay? So in 1972, the Hungnam chemical fertilizer plant, I found these wonderful archival photos online. It had already been standing, and this is the fertilizer plant in North Korea that produced the bulk of the fertilizer, chemical fertilizers that would feed the crops. This 2013, these are my photos, not archival. Same plant, 2013, still there. This gentleman is the manager of the plant. And he came out to speak to this group of about 7, 8 scholars. And this is our other tour guide. This is my friend Andre Schmidt, who's a professor at UToronto. This gentleman spent, 40 minutes in the sun talking to us, lecturing with such great pride over this factory, the fertilizer factory. While I'm listening, I was also very conscious that I might be perhaps laying the seeds of cancer within me, because all I did was smell ammonia. And all of these chemicals, I could just smell it. It was in the air. It is a very old-fashioned factory. It has really not been renovated for a very long time. It's been painted, but it's not been updated. And they're basically trying to reinvent the wheel. North Koreans believe in self-reliance. So they're trying to reinvent the wheel and make chemical fertilizers out of raw material parts. So you can just smell the chemicals. And he was explaining with such pride how the chemicals work together, how many chemicals go in, how much fertilizer they produce, and what's shipped out of their area to feed the countryside, etc. And it was a heartbreaking experience for me, because you could see this man with this pride about their technological capacity, right? And yet, to me, I was very aware that these people who work there are living under health hazards every single day, and that they're doing this in an incredibly laborious way, right? Garment factory, shoe factory, 1972, very, very active consumer production back then. 2016, shoe factory in Wonsan that had been renovated, more modernized, as Kim Jong-un would say. And a kimchi factory that puts out 4,200 tons of kimchi per year, okay? So another commonality between the Southerners and the Northerners, yes, all Koreans do eat kimchi, okay? They have regional variations, but much more mechanized and made into a modern, fancy place. Myth, poor and powerless. The fact is that in the late 50s, early 1960s, the North Koreans received between 50,000 to 70,000 food migrants, we might roughly call refugees, from China, from the northeastern section of China. They fled to the DPRK because of the famine the mass famine that was created by Mao Zedong's disastrous agricultural industrialization policy called the Great Leap Forward. An estimated 30 to 40 million, some people say 50 million people died due to hunger-related, food shortage-related causes. North Koreans, we know, perhaps 200,000 or so, took refuge in China across the border in the 1990s when they had their famine. The North Koreans, in a way, feel that they're owed because the North Koreans took in the Chinese. Many of the Chinese were ethnic Koreans who were living in China. And so North Koreans don't feel a sense of humiliation that they're living in China and having to get food from China and Chinese, because in some ways they were taught the Chinese were treated as guests, set up in camps, and then later on fully integrated into North Korean life, okay, back in the late 50s, early 60s. North Korea was in terms of industrialization and economic wealth at a much higher rate than China in the late 50s and early 60s. Zainichi Koreans are ethnic Koreans living in Japan for a few generations since the colonial era. And ethnic Koreans in Japan, estimated 90,000, moved voluntarily to North Korea in the late 50s up to the 60s, but some as late as 1984 moved to North Korea for, quote, a better life. Okay, it's unthinkable now when we think about North Korea, but not back then. And here I just wanted to show you, we often talk about China as holding the key to denuclearizing North Korea, and we'll hear more about that via our luncheon keynote speaker. But I wanted to at least put this on the table and sort of warm you up for that speech later. In my own view, China does not hold the cards to North Korea. China's been very consistent about it for the last 20 years or so, to all three American administrations, George W. Bush, Obama, and now Trump. The Chinese have not changed their tune. They've said, we cannot, quote, control North Korea. We don't hold the key. You're going to have to figure it out. And my view is that the US has been basically dumping this huge responsibility on China. If you look at China's trade with North Korea, it's relatively recent. It really picks up in 2000. Why? Because the Russians, the Soviets, had been the main patron to the North Koreans up until the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. And then China increasingly took over as the patron. Okay? The North Koreans have been outstanding as a gaming great power China and great power Russia, the two communist great powers throughout the Cold War. The North Koreans played both countries like a fiddle, would get aid, would get military assistance, and still not obey Stalin, Khrushchev, and Mao, right? So when we look at a recalcitrant North Korea, it's not just aimed at the United States. The North Koreans have been like this with great powers. That's how they play the great power game. They milk the great powers for what they want, and yet they don't cooperate, right? So it's fair treatment to the United States. It's nothing different from the way they've treated the Russians and the Chinese. And here, 1972, a quote store. This is a model store, but one thing I want you to notice is the clothing here. White jogori top and usually a black skirt. Just keep that in mind, okay? But it was a pretty prosperous area. 2015, Huffington Post photographers are allowed to go to North Korea for 8 days and take photographs. And there's a whole, you could go into Google and go find this. Tons of photos. And this is a very new, very upper class Pyongyang upper end grocery store. Okay? Not a whole lot of people go, but the elites of Pyongyang, to live in Pyongyang, it's only around 2 million people there. They're considered the hyper elites, right? Because you need to have special passes and special privileges already in rank and status to live in Pyongyang. But out of the 2 million, it's really a few 100,000 who are truly the 1%. North Korea has a 1%. And they live in Pyongyang, and they go to these kinds of grocery stores. And I've been told by friends who visited it, as well as the Huffington Post reporters, they can get Nutella, Oreo, Absolute Vodka. This is a fully stocked liquor store. 1960s, North Korea already had 백화점, a department store. Okay? This is another 백화점, department store. Guess where this is? Seoul. Seoul, 1973. Look at, what's the difference? Right? If you think of Seoul now, it is a raging hot, hot, hot city, so advanced. But in 1973 and 1960s. This is a fancy department store in Pyongyang. I took photographs because I was mesmerized by these fancy children's shoes, and also by the very poor lighting because they're conserving electricity. Okay? And I developed a foot fetish when I was in North Korea. And this is why. As a researcher, you look at things, you notice things, and you say, oh my God, why? How on earth, why? How on earth are North Korean women wearing these fancy, glitzy, bling-bling shoes in this puritanical, poor society where bourgeois showing off fashion is supposed to be, anathema? Where are they getting it? Getting it from China, Chinese made. Often the Chinese products, they copy the South Korean products. So in my head, I thought, okay, South Korea is importing to North Korea the idea of bling bling sandals, right? Even if these are made in China, okay? The heels on this is unthinkable in North Korea even in the 1990s and the 2000s. And I started asking the North Koreans I became a little more friendly with, and they began to trust me. I said, since when did all this start happening? And so I was there 2013. They said about 10 years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, under Kim Jong-il, the father. Right? Does North Korea change? Yes. Do fancy shoes mean that there's a political opening? No. But it means that they have access to different kinds of markets and different consumer choices and ideas about beauty, attractiveness, which in the past, the state told them what the idea of beauty and attractiveness was. Korean traditional dress, hanbok like this, it was so bling bling, I was just really taken aback. And I thought these were just for show. I'll show you in a minute, they're not. So, robotic, I think somebody wrote here about, sort of robotic and controlled people. No self-expression. These are just common North Koreans with parasols. These are beautiful parasols. And they too are most likely made in China. These are made in North Korea. But this is the stuff that you would see in South Korea probably in the 1980s. Okay? And here is a photograph of real North Korean women. It was a celebration day, just walking around in this very florid, colorful, when in the past, remember the store I asked you to look at, the two women, the white top and the black dress? That was the standard dress for North Korean women in Pyongyang in the 1970s, 1980s, and then things change. This is a little girl. I took a photograph at a flower exhibit, and she looks like a little ballerina. She was dressed up really special. And my question is, this little girl, what is her future if she grows up seeing these, seeing this, seeing creativity, some self-expression, some consumer choice, will she want to go back to the white and black dress of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? The answer obviously is no. This is what I call shadow globalization in North Korea. North Korea, people think, is so isolated. It is not. This was a Viennese cafe where my friend Janice Kim, who teaches in Toronto as well, she was taking a picture of her latte, which has a smiley face designed on it, made by this North Korean barista. She's highly trained. This is a covetous job. And this is a Viennese coffee house that set up its investment in North Korea, in Pyongyang, right? And quite amazing. Really good coffee. Very expensive coffee, which most North Koreans can't have. So, myth, Hermit Kingdom, isolated, closed? No. It's got its own access to what I call shadow globalization. North Korea has at least 47 embassies around the world, okay? And these are the countries, the orange area, where they are represented. North America, no. But Canada does have diplomatic ties with North Korea. So it is not as isolated as people think. North Koreans were isolated in the 1950s and 60s into the 70s because South Korea refused to have diplomatic ties with a country if it extended diplomatic ties to the north. It was a competition. And in the 70s, late 70s, South Korea dropped that. And that gave North Korea a way to expand its international ties. So almost all of the EU countries have diplomatic ties. The EU itself has diplomatic ties, and our very important allies like the UK, Germany, Netherlands have diplomatic ties. Canada, Australia, all the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries have diplomatic ties. Norway and Sweden had diplomatic ties. They were the first out of Europe starting in about 1973, 1974. They know so much in terms of institutional history because they had people on the ground in Pyongyang through an embassy. Latin American countries, more than 20 with diplomatic ties. In Asia, almost all of the Southeast Asian nations represented by ASEAN. And then you add Mongolia and Russia and China, of course, and all these other countries. They all have diplomatic ties. Africa, out of 54 countries on the continent of Africa, 29 import goods, 29 import goods from North Korea. North Korea exports to 19 countries, including automobiles, trucks, small buses, plastics, rubber goods, military equipment, etc., to African countries. Okay? North Koreans also have been training African countries, militaries, some which have created devastating human rights abuses, some not, for decades, right? So long historical tie between African countries and North Korea. And this is a globalization at work. This is a pizzeria, Italian restaurant in Pyongyang, which only the elites and some tourists go to. And this is a historian at Toronto, another historian he's originally from Macau, but a historian in Toronto. And these are two North Koreans working in the pizzeria part, okay? It was real pizza. They were trained in Italy. Or rather, the Italian chefs came to North Korea to train. So they were trained by authentic Italian chefs. And we had real wine. And what is this? See, this is where the researcher in me is always on. I was fascinated. I said, Coca-Cola? America doesn't have trade relations with the North. So I started looking. And I started reading. This here says www.coca-cola.it, Italy. It's imported from Italy. So Italy buys from the United States and then imports it to North Korea. This is a fruit drink. Look at this, right? I read everything. This is made in Singapore, product of Singapore, licensed by Japan, manufactured and distributed by a Singapore company, distributed by Hong Kong, imported by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, importé par France, imported by France. This, to me, is proof of globalization for a very limited number in North Korea. And finally, globalization and wealth and the developed economic standards in Pyongyang are only for the very few. North Korea has one of the highest Gini coefficients, which means the higher to 100 you are, the bigger the gap between the rich and poor. This is a so-called communist society. If anybody asks you if North Korea is communist, you're going to have to say no, because look at this income inequality, right? And there is a lot of fast food joints picking up in Pyongyang, invested by Singapore and other outsiders. So while Kim Jong-un grows very heavy with his imported Swiss cheeses and various things, there's also chronic undernourishment and food shortage and what we call a stunted generation stemming from the Great Famine. So undernourishment, and here are just some figures. Okay, out of 25 million people in North Korea, 18 million still have food insecurity. And since 2012, there's been a, quote, radical decline in food aid and other humanitarian aid to North Korea. Why 2012? Sanctions. UN sanctions are making it very difficult, and unilateral sanctions, let's say on the part of the US, is making it very difficult for humanitarian groups to do work in North Korea because the banking systems will not let the humanitarian organizations use the banks in order to extract the money, funds needed to provide for the foods. Because the banks are so afraid they will be penalized by the UN sanctions and the United States. And so humanitarian aid workers are literally going into North Korea with shopping bags filled with cash, which is very unsafe, right? They are just stuffing it because there's no other way to actually do their work. And so humanitarian workers are lobbying members of Congress, trying to make the sanctions more user-friendly for their organization so they can continue their work. Rural areas, North Korea has only 20% arable land. They will never be self-sufficient in food supplies. And many agricultural economists say they should never try to be self-sufficient in food. So when you hear about famines and food shortages, yes, it's caused by the state's incompetencies and also hoarding of food to feed the military. But even under the best of circumstances, because North Korea only has 20% arable land, it's so mountainous, it will never be able to grow the crops. It can only grow, it's a one crop, one season crop economy. You can't do double, triple cropping because of the weather. It's very harsh, and the mountains. See the mountains? And this is just the rural area, people doing their laundry, swimming, playing, doing all sorts of things. I saw just disgustingly dirty water as we traveled, and it was just so heartbreaking because you know that in some cases people are drinking that water as well as doing their laundry in that water and bathing in that water. So, nuclear program. The North Koreans started their nuclear civilian, non-military program in the early 1950s because they wanted to be in on the scientific, technological developments that were in vogue at the time. They have developed their nuclear capacity mostly with Soviet assistance in the very early period and then indigenously. In the 1960s, mid-1960s, Kim Il-sung went to Beijing and asked Mao, "Hello, Mr. Mao, please share with us militarized nuclear technology." after the Chinese had detonated their first nuclear device in 1964, Chairman Mao said no. And the North Koreans said, okay, we're going to figure it out by ourselves. And that's what they've been doing. And this is what I want to end with here. For us outside of North Korea, it is utterly irrational to have a poor country that is technologically behind in the 2000s expend so much money, time, energy on nuclear weapons. For North Korea, I view it as quite rational because they don't see themselves as poor, behind, technologically underdeveloped. They are a fully industrialized society. They're not an agrarian society. So people who have been telling North Korea to follow the Chinese model, it's mistaken. China was an agrarian society predominantly when Deng Xiaoping began the whole economic revolution starting in the late 1970s. North Korea is not an agrarian society in that way. It's a very industrialized society, and it has huge technological ambitions. And so for them, their thinking is, why shouldn't we have nuclear weapons? You guys do. So many people around us do, our neighbors do. And it's the next step. This is our science and our technological inquiry marching to the beat of history. For us, it's absolutely irrational. For them, maybe not so irrational. Anyway, I'll leave it right here since the talk about the Olympics is going on with a joint team.